Marcus Westfield stood at the window of his penthouse office on the 47th floor, watching the city lights flicker below like dying stars, each one representing someone struggling to survive in the empire he'd built with ruthless precision over the past 2 decades. At 42, he controlled a tech conglomerate worth $30 billion, commanded respect in boardrooms across 3 continents, and maintained a carefully curated public image of a visionary genius who transformed industries with a single decision. The reality behind that polished facade was far more complicated, built on sacrifices he'd convinced himself were necessary, relationships he'd discarded like outdated software, and a philosophy that treated human connections as transactions with measurable returns on investment. His marriage to Victoria Chambers, the daughter of an influential senator, had been arranged more like a corporate merger than a union of 2 people in love, complete with prenuptial agreements thick as phone books and clearly defined expectations that neither party pretended to care about beyond public appearances. They'd been married for 8 years, living in separate wings of their Connecticut estate, maintaining the illusion for shareholders and society columns while pursuing their own interests with the kind of cold efficiency that would make divorce lawyers salivate. But there was one person who'd broken through his carefully constructed walls, who'd made him feel something resembling actual human emotion for the first time since he couldn't remember when, though he'd never admit that weakness to anyone, including himself. Elena Rodriguez had started as his executive assistant 3 years ago, hired for her exceptional organizational skills and her ability to anticipate his needs before he voiced them, but somewhere between late-night strategy sessions and early morning coffee runs, something had shifted in ways that terrified him more than any hostile takeover ever could. She was 28, brilliant, beautiful in an understated way that didn't demand attention but somehow commanded it anyway, and she possessed an integrity that felt almost alien in the corporate world he inhabited, where everyone had an angle and nothing came without strings attached. Their affair had begun 6 months ago, after a particularly grueling acquisition deal in Singapore, when exhaustion and champagne had lowered his defenses enough to let her see the man behind the billionaire mask, and for a few reckless weeks he'd allowed himself to believe that maybe he could have something real, something that wasn't calculated and cold and transactional. Then reality had reasserted itself with the force of a freight train when Victoria's father had reminded him that divorce would cost him not just money but political connections that were essential to his next phase of expansion into government contracts. And Marcus had done what he always did when faced with a choice between his heart and his empire. He'd chosen the empire, told Elena it was over with the same emotionless efficiency he used to fire underperforming executives, watched her face crumble as she struggled to maintain her professional composure, and convinced himself he'd made the right decision even as something fundamental broke inside him that night. That had been 3 weeks ago, and Elena had resigned the next morning, leaving behind only a brief email that was professionally courteous and personally devastating in its complete lack of emotion or recrimination, as if what they'd shared hadn't meant anything at all, though he knew that was a lie they were both telling themselves. Since then, he'd thrown himself into work with even more intensity than usual, staying at the office until 2 or 3 in the morning, reviewing reports that didn't need reviewing, making calls to Tokyo and London, and anywhere that wasn't the empty penthouse where silence pressed against him like physical weight. His assistant now was Bradley, efficient young man who did his job perfectly, but brought none of Elena's warmth or insight or the way she'd call him out when he was being unreasonable, which had annoyed him at the time, but now felt like something precious he'd thrown away without appreciating its value. The city below continued its nightly dance of commerce and desperation, millions of people pursuing their own versions of success or survival, and Marcus wondered how many of them were as hollow inside as he felt, how many had traded their humanity for achievement and woke up one day to realize the price had been too high. His phone buzzed with a message from Victoria about some charity gala they needed to attend together, another performance of marital bliss for cameras and donors, and he typed back a confirmation while staring at his reflection in the window, seeing a stranger wearing his face, someone who'd won every battle but lost every war that mattered. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while Marcus was in the middle of a conference call with investors in Frankfurt, discussing projected earnings for the 3rd quarter and deflecting questions about a recent controversy involving labor practices at one of his manufacturing plants in Southeast Asia. Bradley knocked on the door with unusual urgency, which was concerning because the young man had been specifically trained never to interrupt during investor calls, unless the building was literally on fire or someone had died, and Marcus felt a spike of anxiety, wondering which member of his family had finally succumbed to the various health issues that plagued his aging parents. He muted the call and waved Bradley in irritation mixing with concern as his assistant approached with an expression that Marcus couldn't quite read, somewhere between nervousness and pity, which was even more unsettling than the interruption itself. Bradley leaned in and whispered that there was an urgent call from a Dr. Sarah Chen at Manhattan Presbyterian Hospital. She'd called 3 times in the past 15 minutes, and she was insisting it was a matter of life and death regarding someone named Elena Rodriguez, and Marcus felt the world tilt sideways as blood rushed in his ears. He ended the investor call with a rushed excuse about an emergency that couldn't wait, ignoring the protests and concerns, and grabbed the phone from Bradley with hands that had started shaking in a way that would have embarrassed him if he'd had the capacity to care about maintaining composure in that moment. Dr. Chen's voice was professional, but strained when she explained that Elena had been brought into the emergency room 2 hours ago after collapsing at her new workplace. They'd run tests, determine the cause, and in the process they'd discovered she was pregnant, approximately 4 months along, and she'd listed him as her emergency contact. Though she was currently refusing to see him or speak to him, the words hit Marcus like physical blows, each one carrying implications that his mind struggled to process in real time. Pregnant, 4 months, which meant it had happened during their affair, which meant the child was his, which meant everything he'd thought was settled and finished was actually just beginning in ways he couldn't control or calculate or strategize his way through. He demanded to know her condition, whether she was okay, what had caused the collapse, and Dr. Chen explained that Elena was severely anemic and showing signs of malnutrition. Her blood pressure was dangerously low, and they were keeping her overnight for observation and IV fluids. But the bigger concern was that she appeared to have been neglecting her health for weeks, possibly longer, in ways that suggested she wasn't taking care of herself or the pregnancy. Marcus was moving before he'd consciously made the decision, grabbing his jacket and heading for the elevator while barking instructions to Bradley about canceling the rest of his meetings, and somewhere in the back of his mind a voice was asking why he was reacting this way, why he cared so much about a woman he'd discarded, a pregnancy that complicated his carefully ordered life beyond measure. The drive to the hospital took 25 minutes through Manhattan traffic that seemed deliberately designed to test his patience, every red light and slow-moving taxi feeling like a personal insult, and he used the time to call his lawyer to discuss the implications, the potential complications, the need for paternity tests and confidentiality agreements and damage control if this became public knowledge. His lawyer, shark named Davidson, who'd protected Marcus from countless scandals over the years, pointed out that if Elena was refusing to see him, she clearly didn't want his involvement, which could actually work in his favor if he wanted to maintain plausible deniability or negotiate a quiet settlement that would keep everything out of the press. But something in Marcus rejected that calculation. Some part of him that had been dormant or suppressed was suddenly roaring to life, insisting that this was different, that Elena was different, that he couldn't just throw money at this situation and walk away like he'd done with every other problem in his life. He thought about the way she'd looked at him that last night when he'd ended things, the hurt and betrayal in her eyes that she'd tried so hard to hide, the dignity with which she'd walked away without begging or arguing or making a scene, and he realized with sickening clarity that she'd probably already known she was pregnant when he'd broken her heart, had chosen not to tell him because she knew exactly what kind of man he was, the kind who would see a child as a liability rather than a gift. The hospital corridor smelled like antiseptic and desperation, that particular combination of cleaning chemicals and human anxiety that seemed universal to medical facilities, regardless of how expensive or exclusive they claimed to be. And Marcus walked past rooms filled with people facing their own crises while nurses and doctors moved with practiced efficiency through the choreography of crisis management. Dr. Chen met him outside Elena's room, a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes that had clearly seen too much suffering to be easily impressed by wealth or status, and she blocked his path with the kind of polite firmness that suggested she'd dealt with plenty of demanding family members who thought money entitled them to special treatment. She explained again that Elena was stable but weak, that the pregnancy was high risk due to her current condition, and most importantly that the patient had been very clear about not wanting to see Marcus or have any contact with him, a wish that Dr. Chen was legally and ethically obligated to respect regardless of who he was or how much he donated to the hospital's various fundraising campaigns. Marcus started to argue, to insist on his rights as the father, to pull out the various cards he usually played when someone told him no, but something stopped him when he looked through the small window in the door and saw Elena lying in the hospital bed, looking smaller and more fragile than he'd ever seen her, one hand resting protectively on her barely visible belly, while she stared out the window at the city beyond. She looked exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness, like someone who'd been carrying an impossible weight for too long, and had finally reached the point where her body had simply given up, and Marcus felt something crack in his chest as he realized that he'd done this to her, that his rejection had contributed to the state she was in now. Dr. Chen's voice softened as she told him that Elena had been working 2 jobs since leaving his company, trying to build up savings before the baby came, pushing herself to the point of collapse, because she was determined to do everything on her own without asking for help from anyone, especially not from him. The words were delivered without judgment, but Marcus heard the condemnation anyway, the implicit criticism of a man who had billions, while the mother of his child was working herself to death out of pride and necessity, and he wanted to defend himself, to explain that he hadn't known, that she should have told him, that this wasn't his fault. But standing there looking at her through the glass, watching the way her hand moved in small circles on her belly like she was already trying to comfort the child inside, he couldn't make those excuses sound convincing even in his own head, because the truth was that he'd made it very clear she couldn't come to him, that he'd closed that door with such finality, that of course she wouldn't reach out even in crisis. He asked Dr. Chen to at least tell Elena that he was there, that he wanted to help, that they needed to talk, but the doctor shook her head and said that what Elena needed right now was rest and freedom from stress, and his presence was clearly causing her more anxiety than comfort based on the way her heart rate had spiked when she'd heard he was in the building. So Marcus did something he almost never did. He accepted defeat and backed away, but not before standing at that window for another long moment, watching Elena breathe, watching her exist in a space where he wasn't welcome, where his money and power and influence meant absolutely nothing compared to the simple fact that she didn't want him there. He left his private number with Dr. Chen along with instructions to call him immediately if Elena's condition changed or if she needed anything at all, and he made it clear that all her medical expenses should be billed directly to him regardless of whether she knew about it or consented to it, using his leverage with the hospital board to ensure they wouldn't refuse his money even if the patient would. Walking back through those corridors toward the elevator, Marcus passed a window that showed the maternity ward, where new fathers stood holding tiny bundles wrapped in blue or pink blankets, their faces showing a mixture of terror and joy that he'd never allowed himself to imagine experiencing, and something fundamental shifted in his understanding of what he'd been running from all these years. He'd spent 2 decades building an empire, accumulating wealth and power that most people couldn't even conceptualize, convincing himself that success was measured in zeros on a balance sheet and the fear he could inspire in a boardroom. But standing in that hospital watching the woman he'd thrown away carry his child, he finally understood what his father had tried to tell him before the old man died, that you could win every battle and still lose the only war that mattered. Marcus didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in his home office with the lights off, staring at his phone and waiting for updates from Dr. Chen that didn't come, which he took as a good sign because surely they would call if Elena's condition worsened, though the rational part of his brain recognized that no news simply meant no change, rather than improvement. At 3 in the morning he finally gave up on the pretense of rest and called his head of security, a former FBI agent named Patricia Holloway, who'd been handling sensitive situations for him for over a decade, and he asked her to find out everything about Elena's life over the past 3 weeks, where she was living, where she was working, how she was surviving, information he suddenly needed with an urgency that surprised even him. Patricia had questions about privacy and legality and whether this was really the kind of thing he wanted documented in a way that could potentially be subpoenaed if things went sideways, but Marcus overrode her objections with the kind of authority that made it clear this wasn't a request, and by the time the sun rose over Manhattan, Patricia had assembled a preliminary report that made Marcus want to punch through the mahogany desk his grandfather had left him. Elena had moved into a studio apartment in Queens, the kind of place that charged by the week and didn't ask too many questions about background checks or credit scores, sharing a bathroom with 3 other tenants, and living in a space barely larger than his walk-in closet. She was working as a server at an all-night diner in Midtown, pulling shifts from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 6 days a week, and she'd picked up a second job stocking shelves at a grocery store from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. on the days she wasn't completely exhausted from the overnight shift, which meant she was basically working around the clock with maybe 4 hours of sleep scattered in between. The report included surveillance photos that Patricia had obtained from various sources, images that showed Elena in a diner uniform that hung loose on her frame because she'd lost weight everywhere except her growing belly, carrying plates of food to customers who probably never looked at her face, or wondered about her story, or realized they were being served by someone with a master's degree in business administration from Columbia. There were photos of her at the grocery store, struggling to lift boxes that were clearly too heavy for someone in her condition, pausing to lean against shelves when she thought no one was watching, the exhaustion evident in every line of her body. Patricia had also managed to obtain Elena's medical records from before her hospital admission, which showed she'd missed 2 prenatal appointments due to work conflicts, that she was taking prenatal vitamins when she could afford them, but often skipped them to save money, and that she'd been flagged by a clinic physician as high risk due to stress and inadequate nutrition, but had declined additional testing because she didn't have insurance. The records painted a picture of someone trying desperately to do the right thing, while the world made it nearly impossible, working herself to death out of pride and stubbornness and a determination not to be seen as weak or dependent, especially not on the man who'd made it clear she meant nothing to him beyond a temporary distraction from his hollow existence. Marcus read through the report 3 times, each pass revealing new details that made him feel sicker, like the fact that Elena's landlord had tried to evict her twice for being late on rent, or that she'd sold her car to cover moving expenses, or that she'd pawned the few pieces of jewelry she owned, including a necklace her grandmother had given her before dying, pieces that had sentimental value far beyond their modest monetary worth. There was a notation that Elena had applied for food assistance but had been denied because she made just slightly too much to qualify, which was darkly hilarious considering she was barely scraping by while his ex-lover sat on enough money to end world hunger if he felt like being charitable instead of hoarding wealth like some kind of corporate dragon. Patricia had included a financial analysis showing that Elena was barely making $1,600 a month after taxes between both jobs, and her expenses including rent, utilities, food, transportation, and basic necessities were running about $1,400, which left her with $200 to save for medical expenses and baby supplies and 1,000 other things she would need when the child arrived. The math was impossible, the situation unsustainable, and yet Elena was grinding through it, with the same determination and competence she'd brought to managing his schedule, and his crisis and his entire professional life for 3 years. Except now she was doing it alone and pregnant and slowly destroying her health in the process. Marcus called Patricia back and told her to have someone watching Elena's apartment and both her workplaces around the clock, not to interfere but to make sure she was safe and to alert him immediately if anything concerning happened. Patricia agreed while pointing out that what he was describing was essentially stalking and could get very legally complicated if Elena found out and decided to press charges. He didn't care about the legal complication, didn't care about anything except the growing certainty that he'd been catastrophically wrong about everything, that the empire he'd built was worthless, if it meant the mother of his child was pawning her grandmother's necklace to make rent while he lived in a mansion with 17 bedrooms he never used. Victoria was having breakfast on the terrace when Marcus finally came home, sitting at the wrought iron table with her tablet and a fruit plate, looking every inch the senator's daughter she'd been raised to be, perfectly styled even at 8 in the morning, ready for whatever photo opportunity or charity lunch was on her schedule for the day. She glanced up when he walked out, noted his rumpled suit and the fact that he clearly hadn't slept, and went back to scrolling through whatever political strategy memo or society gossip was currently occupying her attention, because in 8 years of marriage they'd perfected the art of coexisting without actually connecting in any meaningful way. Marcus poured himself coffee from the service set that their housekeeper had prepared, the expensive imported beans and the silver pot and the fine china, all part of the elaborate theater of their lives, and he considered how to start this conversation, whether there was any way to tell your wife that your former mistress was pregnant, without it sounding exactly as bad as it actually was. Victoria saved him the trouble by setting down her tablet and looking at him with eyes that were sharp with intelligence and completely devoid of warmth, asking if he was finally going to tell her about the pregnant assistant, or if she was supposed to keep pretending she didn't know. And Marcus felt the last pretense of his carefully controlled life crumble into dust. She explained that her father's people had been tracking the situation since Elena left the company, standard procedure for monitoring potential threats to the family's political interests, and they'd known about the pregnancy for 6 weeks, long enough to prepare contingency plans and draft settlement agreements and generally treat the entire situation like the political scandal it would become if not properly managed. Victoria's tone was matter-of-fact as she outlined the options they'd already explored: a generous payment in exchange for confidentiality agreements and Elena's agreement to move somewhere far from New York, perhaps overseas where American tabloids couldn't easily find her full medical care and support, but with the explicit understanding that Marcus would have no parental rights or involvement in the child's life. The casualness with which she discussed paying off the mother of his child and exiling her like some kind of medieval inconvenience made Marcus want to throw his coffee cup through the French doors, but instead he listened in growing horror as Victoria continued explaining the strategy, how they could spin it if it leaked, how his lawyers had already prepared statements attributing it to a brief lapse in judgment during a difficult period, how the whole thing could be handled with minimal damage to both his business reputation and her father's political career. Marcus finally interrupted to ask if she'd considered that this was his child they were discussing, a human being, not a public relations problem, and Victoria looked at him with something approaching pity, as if he was being naive or sentimental in ways that were almost endearing, but ultimately irrelevant to the practical realities of their situation. She pointed out that children were born out of wedlock every day, that financial support without emotional involvement was actually the more responsible choice given their circumstances, and that Marcus getting attached or trying to play father would only complicate matters and potentially create legal vulnerabilities that could be exploited by Elena or by political enemies, who would love nothing more than to paint the Westfield Chambers alliance as hypocritical and morally bankrupt. The speech was delivered with the kind of logical precision that would have impressed him in a boardroom but felt monstrous in the context of discussing his unborn child. And Marcus realized that he'd married someone who was essentially a female version of himself, someone who'd been raised to see every situation as a chess game where people were pieces to be moved or sacrificed as strategy required. He told Victoria that he wasn't going to pay Elena off, wasn't going to send her away, wasn't going to pretend this child didn't exist, and his wife smiled, that cold smile she used when dealing with people she considered foolish or optimistic beyond reason. She asked what exactly he planned to do then: divorce her and marry the pregnant assistant like some kind of romantic comedy, throw away all the political connections and business advantages their marriage provided for the fantasy of playing house with a woman who clearly wanted nothing to do with him, based on the fact that she hadn't told him about the pregnancy and had refused to see him at the hospital. The words hit harder because they were true, because Elena had chosen to work herself to exhaustion rather than come to him, because whatever they'd had was clearly so damaged that she preferred poverty to his support, and Marcus had no answer that didn't sound delusional or self-serving. Victoria stood up, smoothing her designer dress with practiced elegance, and told him to take a few days to think clearly, to remember what was actually important versus what was temporary emotion, and she reminded him that she'd been a perfect wife by the standards they'd agreed to, had never interfered with his affairs or made demands beyond public appearances, and she deserved the same courtesy of being allowed to protect her interests and her father's political future from his mistake. She walked back into the house, leaving Marcus alone on the terrace with his cold coffee and the growing realization that his entire life had been built on foundations that were rotting from the inside, that success measured by wealth and power meant nothing if you couldn't look at yourself in the mirror without seeing a monster staring back. Marcus spent the next 2 days in a kind of paralysis, going through the motions of meetings and calls while his mind spun through scenarios and consequences, each potential path forward seeming more impossible than the last, like trying to solve an equation where every variable was working against him. He checked with Dr. Chen twice a day for updates on Elena's condition, learning that she was recovering physically but remained adamant about not seeing him or accepting his help, and the hospital was preparing to discharge her in another 24 hours, sending her back to that studio apartment in Queens, and those 2 jobs that were slowly killing her, Patricia's surveillance reports continued arriving with clockwork precision, documenting Elena's life in detail that felt invasive even as Marcus couldn't stop reading them. Photos of her leaving the hospital with a plastic bag of her belongings, taking the subway back to Queens because she couldn't afford a taxi, stopping at a dollar store to buy bread and peanut butter because that was what her budget allowed. There was a photo that particularly haunted him, Elena sitting on a bench outside her apartment building at twilight, one hand on her belly, and her face turned toward the setting sun, and something about her expression, peaceful despite everything, made Marcus understand that she'd already made her own decisions about what mattered and what didn't, and his money and power were firmly in the second category. He found himself thinking about his own father, a man who'd built the initial fortune that Marcus had multiplied 100-fold, but who'd always insisted that family came first, that wealth was meaningless without people to share it with, advice that Marcus had dismissed as sentimental nonsense from an older generation that didn't understand how the modern world worked. His father had died 5 years ago, disappointed in Marcus's marriage to Victoria, disappointed in the cold efficiency with which his son ran his life, and Marcus had attended the funeral with appropriate gravitas, but hadn't really grieved, had been too busy closing a major deal to spend much time reflecting on loss. Now, standing in his home office surrounded by expensive furniture and original artwork that he barely noticed, Marcus wondered what his father would say about this situation, whether the old man would be disappointed again, or whether this might have been an opportunity for redemption, if Marcus could figure out how to do the right thing for once in his calculating existence. The problem was that Marcus genuinely didn't know what the right thing was anymore. All his usual frameworks for decision-making were useless when applied to questions of love and responsibility and the kind of moral choices that couldn't be delegated to lawyers or consultants. He thought about Elena's words from their last night together when she'd tried to tell him that some things were more important than business, that he was hollowing himself out in pursuit of goals that wouldn't matter on his deathbed, and he'd dismissed her concerns as naive, as the kind of thinking that kept people poor and powerless while pragmatists like him built empires. The memory made him cringe now because she'd been right, because here he was with $30 billion and absolute misery, unable to sleep, unable to eat, unable to function because the one person he actually cared about was working night shifts at a diner to avoid asking him for help. Marcus pulled up the financial reports that Bradley had prepared for the quarterly board meeting, pages of projections and growth targets and strategic initiatives, and he realized that he couldn't remember why any of it had seemed important, what he was even building this empire for, if not to share it with someone, to leave it to someone, to have it mean something beyond just accumulating more zeros. There was a nursery in the east wing of the Connecticut estate, designed by Victoria's decorator when they'd first married, equipped with the finest furniture and organic linens, and every possible amenity, but it had never been used because neither of them had wanted children, had seen them as complications to carefully managed lives rather than blessings worth celebrating. Marcus walked through the empty room now, running his hand along the pristine crib that had never held a baby, imagining his child, Elena's child, growing up in that studio apartment in Queens instead of this palace, and the unfairness of it made him want to tear the room apart with his bare hand. He called his lawyer Davidson and told him to prepare divorce papers, the conversation brief and professional, Davidson asking if he was sure, and Marcus saying he'd never been more certain of anything in his life, which was probably true even if he had no idea what came after the certainty. Then he called Patricia and told her to stop the surveillance, that he was done watching Elena's life from a distance like some kind of coward, and Patricia asked what he was planning to do instead, and Marcus realized he didn't have an answer yet, just a growing determination that hiding behind lawyers and money and fear of consequences was exactly the kind of thinking that had created this disaster in the first place. Marcus started small, or what passed for small in his world, where grand gestures were the default setting for solving problems, beginning with anonymous deliveries to Elena's apartment building, groceries and prenatal vitamins and practical items that she needed but couldn't afford, left outside her door in the early morning hours, when he knew she'd be coming home from her overnight shift at the diner. He used Patricia's surveillance network to time the deliveries perfectly, watching from a distance through traffic cameras and security feeds, as Elena would find the packages, her expression cycling through confusion and suspicion before she'd carry them inside, and he told himself he was helping, even though he knew this was cowardice, another way of throwing money at the problem, instead of actually facing the woman he'd hurt. The deliveries continued for a week, and Elena never acknowledged them, never tried to return them or leave a note, and Marcus interpreted this as tacit acceptance, even though the rational part of his brain recognized it might just be desperate pragmatism from someone who couldn't afford pride when it came to feeding herself and her baby. He paid off her rent for 6 months directly to the landlord, who was happy to accept cash and not ask questions about the source, and he established an anonymous trust that would cover all her medical expenses, working through enough legal intermediaries that Elena would never know the money came from him, unless she hired a forensic accountant to trace it back. These gestures made him feel slightly less monstrous, but also highlighted the absurdity of the situation. The fact that he could solve every material problem Elena faced with the equivalent of pocket change, while remaining fundamentally unable to address the actual issue, which was that he'd broken her trust, and now she wanted nothing to do with him regardless of how much money he threw at the situation. His divorce from Victoria was proceeding with the cold efficiency of any corporate dissolution, assets being divided, and agreements being drafted, and her father, the senator, was making threatening noises about political consequences and business relationships that would be jeopardized. But Marcus found he didn't care the way he would have even a month ago. Victoria herself took the news with remarkable composure, pointing out that she'd expected this eventually and had already started making plans for her next strategic marriage, perhaps to a young congressman from a blue-chip district who needed her father's money and connections more than Marcus ever had. And their final conversation was so devoid of emotion that Marcus wondered if either of them were actually human, or just very sophisticated robots programmed to simulate the appearance of living. The press hadn't gotten wind of the pregnancy yet, which was a minor miracle in the age of social media and TMZ, and Marcus knew the clock was ticking before someone connected the dots, and the story exploded across every tabloid and business publication. But he couldn't bring himself to care about the reputational damage, another sign that something fundamental had broken in his programming. He found himself driving past the diner where Elena worked, sitting in his car across the street at 3 in the morning, watching her through the windows as she poured coffee and took orders and moved with practiced efficiency, despite the exhaustion that was evident even from a distance, and he felt like a stalker, but couldn't stop himself from needing to see that she was okay. Once she came outside on her breath, standing on the sidewalk in the pre-dawn darkness, rubbing her lower back and looking up at the sky, and Marcus had started to get out of the car, to cross the street and finally talk to her, but something stopped him, maybe the peace on her face despite everything, maybe the fear that his presence would shatter whatever fragile stability she'd built. He went back to his office instead and worked until the sun came up, then called Bradley in and told him to liquidate $5 million in assets, and establish a proper trust fund for the babe, something that would ensure his child never wanted for anything, even if Elena continued refusing his help, because at minimum he could do that much, could make sure that his son or daughter had opportunities and security even if he never got to be part of their life. Bradley took notes without judgment, used to Marcus's increasingly erratic decisions, and mentioned that there were rumors circulating in the office about why Elena had left and whether the boss was having some kind of breakdown, and Marcus told him to let them gossip, that he didn't care what anyone thought anymore, which was both liberating and terrifying because caring what people thought had been the foundation of his entire adult life. The surveillance report that afternoon included a note that Elena had stopped at a baby store on her way home from the grocery job, spending 30 minutes looking at cribs and car seats and tiny clothes, not buying anything but just looking. And Patricia had included a photo that showed Elena's face as she held up a small blue onesie, the longing and love and fear all visible in her expression. And Marcus made a decision that he probably should have made weeks ago but had been too proud or too scared to actually follow through on until now. Elena's next prenatal appointment was on a Thursday afternoon, the one regular medical care she allowed herself despite the cost, and Marcus knew about it because he'd been paying attention to her schedule in ways that would absolutely qualify as obsessive if anyone asked, which no one did, because he'd stopped confiding in people months ago. He waited in the clinic's hallway, having arrived an hour early to make sure he didn't miss her, sitting in uncomfortable plastic chairs surrounded by pregnant women and anxious partners, feeling completely out of place in his tailored suit, among people who were dealing with the normal struggles of bringing new life into the world without the complications that billions of dollars and emotional dysfunction created. Elena appeared at the reception desk, looking tired but determined, wearing the uniform from her grocery store job because she'd come straight from her shift, and Marcus watched her check in and take a seat in the waiting area, pulling out a worn paperback novel to pass the time, and he realized she hadn't seen him yet, didn't know he was there waiting for a conversation she'd been avoiding for months. He let her sit for 10 minutes, partly because he was a coward and partly because he was trying to figure out what to say, how to begin explaining or apologizing or asking for forgiveness when he knew he probably didn't deserve any of those things. And finally he stood up and walked over and sat down in the chair beside her, and the way she flinched when she recognized him made his chest hurt in ways that $30 billion couldn't fix. She asked him what he was doing there in a voice that was carefully controlled but brittle with emotion, and Marcus said they needed to talk, that he knew about the baby and about her refusing help and about everything she'd been going through, and Elena's face went through several expressions before settling on a kind of resigned anger that suggested she'd been expecting this confrontation eventually. She asked how he knew, and Marcus admitted he'd had her followed, had been watching her life play out from a distance because he was too much of a coward to actually face her, and he could see her processing this invasion of privacy, deciding whether to be angry or just exhausted, ultimately choosing exhaustion because she didn't have the energy for anger anymore. They sat there in the clinic waiting room, surrounded by other women dealing with their own pregnancy journeys, and Marcus tried to explain what he'd been doing, the trust fund and the rent payments and the groceries, and Elena cut him off to tell him she knew it was him, that she wasn't an idiot, that anonymous deliveries perfectly timed to her schedule were obviously from someone with resources and information that could only come from surveillance. She'd accepted the help because she needed it, because pride didn't feed her baby or pay for doctor visits, but accepting practical assistance didn't mean she forgave him or wanted him in her life, and Marcus needed to understand that the money didn't fix what he'd broken when he'd looked her in the eye and told her she meant nothing to him. The words were delivered without malice but with a kind of final authority that made Marcus understand he was running out of time and chances, that Elena had already made peace with doing this alone, and his sudden interest in being involved was more about his own guilt than her actual need. He asked her why she hadn't told him when she first found out, and Elena laughed bitterly, reminding him that he'd ended their relationship specifically because it interfered with his carefully ordered life, had made it clear that she was disposable, and that his empire and his marriage and his reputation were more important than anything they'd shared. She'd found out she was pregnant 2 days before he'd broken things off, had been planning to tell him when he'd preempted that conversation by explaining that she was a mistake he needed to correct, and why would she tell someone that news when they'd just informed her she was an inconvenience they needed to eliminate? Marcus tried to explain that he hadn't known, that he would have handled things differently if he'd known about the baby, and Elena cut him off again to point out that the fact he'd only changed his mind after learning about the pregnancy was exactly the problem, that she wanted someone who valued her for herself, not just as a vessel for his child, and he'd proven beyond doubt that he wasn't that person. The nurse called her name before Marcus could respond, and Elena stood up, looking down at him with an expression that combined pity and disappointment, and told him that he could set up whatever trust funds or support structures he wanted, that she wouldn't stop him from providing financially because that was his responsibility, but she didn't want him at appointments or trying to be involved in the pregnancy, and after the baby was born they could discuss custody arrangements through lawyers like the business transaction he'd reduced everything else in his life to. She walked through the door to the examination rooms, and left Marcus sitting in that plastic chair, surrounded by the evidence of life continuing despite his plans and control, and something finally broke through the walls he'd spent decades building, some understanding that you couldn't manage your way into meaning or strategize your way into love, that Elena was right, and he'd destroyed something precious because he'd been too afraid to let it matter more than his carefully constructed empire of nothing. The board meeting that afternoon was supposed to be important, discussions about a major acquisition that could expand his empire into new markets and cement his position as one of the most influential tech entrepreneurs of his generation. But Marcus sat at the head of the conference table, barely hearing the presentations, his mind replaying Elena's words in the clinic, the way she'd looked at him with disappointment that cut deeper than anger ever could. His executive team noticed his distraction, exchanged concerned glances about their boss who'd been acting increasingly erratic for weeks, and finally Bradley interrupted the presentation to ask if Marcus wanted to reschedule, since he clearly wasn't engaged with the material. Marcus looked around the table at these people who depended on him for their livelihoods, who respected his business acumen and feared his judgment, and he realized he didn't care about any of it, that the acquisition and the expansion and the quarterly projections were just elaborate distractions from the fundamental emptiness of his existence. He told them to proceed without him, that Bradley could handle the preliminary negotiations, and they could meet again when Marcus had his head straight, and he walked out of his own board meeting, leaving behind shocked silence and the beginning of rumors that the great Marcus Westfield was finally losing his grip on the empire he'd built. He drove to Connecticut, to the estate he'd shared with Victoria, walking through rooms that had never felt like home, past furniture selected by decorators, and art chosen by consultants, and all the expensive trappings of a life built for show rather than substance. In the nursery that had never been used, Marcus sat on the floor in the golden afternoon light and tried to imagine what his life would have been like if he'd made different choices, if he'd valued connection over control, if he'd been brave enough to choose love when it was offered, instead of retreating into the familiar cold comfort of wealth and power. His phone buzzed with messages from his lawyer about the Vuzis proceedings, from Patricia with another surveillance report, from business contacts wondering what was happening with various deals, and Marcus turned it off, sat in silence for the first time in years, and let himself feel the full weight of what he'd lost and what he was losing. That evening he drove to Queens, parking across from Elena's building not to watch or surveil, but just to be near someone who mattered, someone real who'd seen through his carefully constructed persona to the hollow man underneath, and had tried to tell him there was a better way to live. He thought about his father's funeral, how he'd stood at the grave and felt nothing because he'd already cut himself off from emotion years before, how he'd gone back to work the next day and closed a major deal, and convinced himself that was a more appropriate tribute than grief. His father had told him once that the measure of a man wasn't what he built, but what he built it for, who benefited from his success beyond himself, and Marcus had dismissed it as the philosophy of someone who'd never achieved true great and never understood that sentimentality was a luxury that ambitious men couldn't afford. Now, sitting in his car, watching lights come on in Elena's window as she returned from whatever job she'd been working that evening, Marcus finally understood what his father had been trying to teach him, that all the success in the world meant nothing if you were too afraid to be vulnerable, too controlled to let yourself need someone, too proud to admit when you'd made catastrophic mistakes. He pulled up the photo on his phone that Dr. Chen had sent, the ultrasound image of his child, a grainy black and white image that medical professionals could interpret, but that looked like abstract art to Marcus, and he tried to see his future in those indistinct shapes, tried to imagine what kind of father he could be if Elena ever gave him the chance. The problem was that Marcus had spent his entire adult life being certain, making decisions based on data and strategy and carefully calculated risk assessment, and now he was facing a situation where none of his usual tools worked, where the outcome depended entirely on another person's willingness to forgive and trust, and take a leap of faith, with someone who'd proven he didn't deserve any of those things. Rain started falling, drops on the windshield creating patterns that distorted the lights of the building, and Marcus sat there in the expensive car that cost more than most people made in several years, and he finally admitted to himself what had been true all along, that he'd fallen in love with Elena somewhere between the late-night strategy sessions and the morning coffee, that she'd become essential to his life in ways he'd been too afraid to acknowledge, and pushing her away had been an act of cowardice dressed up as pragmatism. He thought about Victoria and their cold, efficient marriage, about the years of pretending that emotional distance was sophistication rather than damage, about building walls so high and thick that nothing could get in to hurt him but also nothing could get in to save him. His phone, still turned off, held hundreds of messages that all felt meaningless compared to the one question that actually mattered, whether Elena would ever look at him again with something besides disappointment and resignation, whether his child would know him as anything more than a name on support checks and legal documents. Marcus had conquered markets and destroyed competitors and built an empire that would outlast him, But sitting in that car, watching rain fall on a modest apartment building in Queens, he finally understood that he'd spent decades winning battles while losing the only war that mattered, and now the only question was whether it was too late to surrender. The call came at 4 in the morning 3 weeks later, Dr. Chen's voice professional but urgent, explaining that Elena was in labor and it was happening fast, earlier than expected, and she'd finally agreed to let the hospital contact Marcus, as the father, even if she still wasn't sure she wanted him there. Marcus was dressed and in his car before fully processing the information, driving through empty New York streets at speeds that would have gotten anyone else arrested, calling ahead to make sure the hospital had everything they needed, that no expense would be spared, that Elena would have the best care possible regardless of her wishes or her pride. He arrived at the hospital just as dawn was breaking over the city, the emergency entrance bathed in that peculiar early morning light that makes everything look both hopeful and fragile, and Doc Chen met him in the lobby with news that Elena had delivered a healthy baby girl 40 minutes ago. Both mother and daughter were stable, and Elena had said Marcus could come to the room if he promised to just listen, to not try to fix anything or manage the situation, or turn it into another business negotiation. Walking down that corridor felt like walking toward judgment, each step bringing him closer to the woman he'd hurt, and the child he'd never expected to have, and Marcus realized his hands were shaking in a way they hadn't since his first major presentation to investors 2 decades ago, except this time, the stakes weren't measured in dollars, but in something far, far valuable and fragile. Elena was sitting up in the hospital bed when he entered, looking exhausted and radiant in the way that women do after giving birth, and in her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in hospital blankets, a miniature human being with a shock of dark hair and a face so perfect it made Marcus's chest ache. He stopped in the doorway, afraid to come closer, afraid that his presence would shatter whatever peace Elena had found, and they looked at each other across the distance of months and mistakes, and all the things that couldn't be unsaid. She asked if he wanted to meet his daughter, and Marcus nodded because he didn't trust his voice, and Elena gestured him closer with a small tired smile that contained none of the warmth he remembered, but also none of the anger he'd feared. He approached the bed like someone approaching something sacred, and Elena shifted the bundle slightly so he could see the baby's face clearly, tiny features scrunched up in sleep, miniature fingers curled into fists, breathing with the kind of perfection that only new life possesses. Marcus reached out with one finger to touch his daughter's hand, and she grasped it reflexively, and something fundamental shifted in his understanding of himself and what mattered and why he'd spent so many years building walls that now felt like prison bars. Elena's voice was quiet when she told him they'd named the baby Sophia, after her grandmother who'd given her that necklace she'd pawned to make rent, and Marcus felt the weight of all his failures pressing down as he realized this child had been named after the woman whose jewelry Elena had sold because he'd been too proud or too damaged to support the mother of his child. They sat in silence for several minutes, Marcus holding Sophia's tiny hand while Elena watched with an expression he couldn't quite read, and finally he asked what happened now, whether there was any chance Elena might someday forgive him, whether he could be part of Sophia's life in some meaningful way beyond writing checks and establishing trust funds. Elena's response was measured and honest, explaining that forgiveness wasn't something that happened in a moment, but was a process that would take time and consistent proof that he'd actually changed, that she wouldn't let Sophia grow up with a father who treated people as assets to be managed and discarded when they became inconvenient. She said he could visit, could be involved in the baby's life, but she needed to see evidence that he was capable of actually caring about someone beyond what they could do for him, that he could be present and vulnerable, and all the things that had terrified him into pushing her away in the first place. Marcus agreed to her terms without negotiation or counteroffer, and in that moment of surrender he felt something like hope breaking through the walls he'd spent his life building, a small crack that suggested maybe it wasn't too late to become the man his daughter deserved, the partner Elena might eventually trust again. She told him Sophia needed to eat, and he should probably go get some rest, that they could discuss custody arrangements and logistics later when they were both less exhausted, and Marcus stood to leave, taking one last look at his daughter sleeping peacefully, unaware that her father was a man who'd built an empire but lost his soul and was now trying to figure out how to rebuild from the foundation up. Walking out of the hospital into the morning light, Marcus called Bradley and told him to clear his schedule for the next month, that he was taking time off for the first time in his professional career, and Bradley's shocked silence spoke volumes about how unprecedented this decision was. Then Marcus called his lawyer and told him to accelerate the divorce proceedings, to be generous with Victoria beyond what was required, and to stop trying to protect his assets because he was done letting fear of loss dictate his choices. He drove back to his penthouse office one last time, looking at the city spread out below that massive window where he'd stood so many nights feeling empty and powerful, and he realized that power without purpose was just another form of poverty, that he'd been the richest poor man in New York, surrounded by wealth, but starving for the kind of connection he'd been too afraid to let himself want. The sun was fully up now, commuters filling the streets below to chase their own versions of success, and Marcus thought about Sophia sleeping in that hospital room, about Elena watching over her with fierce protective love, and he made a decision that his younger self would have called weakness, but that he now understood was the first truly strong thing he'd done in years. He was going to learn how to be a father, how to be present, how to value people over profit and connection over control, and if it meant dismantling parts of the empire he'd built or stepping away from opportunities that would have consumed him before, then that was a price he was finally willing to pay. The story wasn't over, Marcus knew. It was actually just beginning, and the outcome was far from certain, but standing in that office watching the city come alive with another day of endless striving, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, something that might have been hope or might have been simply the recognition that he was still capable of change, that the hollow man who'd stood at this window broken and alone was starting to understand that the only thing more powerful than wealth or status or control was the courage to be vulnerable enough to let yourself love and be loved in return.